Hello and welcome to Money Trail with me, Amir Arfat. Today, the fall of capitalism, or rather the rise of a giant vampire squid of militarist corporatism.
The global price of capitalism is not a myth, but an increasingly inescapable reality. The current economic meltdown is indeed a harbinger of conflict and the collapse of capitalism. Whether called the Great Economic Depression, the Mexican peso crisis, the Japanese crisis, the Asian crisis, or the Great Economic Meltdown, one central tendency is that capitalism, like any other economic system, is vulnerable to the vagaries and vicissitudes of change. The Occupy Wall Street phenomenon in Obama's America has been described as a protest against corporate greed, which is a euphemism for exploitation of wage labor. It demonstrates that capitalism has had serious cracks in spite of attempts by neoliberalists to cover it up with intellectual sophistry.
What has happened historically is that we, a few hundred years ago, we had the South Sea bubble. Then, more recently, every 10, 15, 20 years, we've had, crisis in capitalism. We had, the Big Depression in the 1920s and just before the Second World War, after which a concept came out called the New Capitalism. But the reality of capitalism is that it really benefits the minority.
According to the World Bank, the current global economic meltdown is the worst in at least 70 years. Around the world, millions of jobs have been lost and counting. Between 200,000 and 400,000 more children will die every year until 2015, the target year for the Millennium Development Goals. The Obama administration has injected massive stimulus policies into the economy, yet the signs are still ominous. In effect, America, the capitalist giant, is adhering to the tenets of Keynesianism. As the pillars of capitalism are trembling, it is becoming more obvious that neoliberalism is in conflict with European monetary integration. Even Keynesian thinkers, the main brickmakers of the Bretton Woods system, never contemplated a capitalist system that would seek to maximize the international outflow of goods and capital.
We have an unsustainable system. We have an unsustainable financial system. And the financial system controls every other aspect of society, and it's not sustainable. And it's not the people that are the problem. It's the small number of individuals that control the financial system.
Capitalism is now being haunted by the specter of the Great Depression. The system also faces a profound moral crisis in that spectacular gains of capitalism are based in theft and violence.
What we have seen, the crisis that has we've been facing in both Europe and America has been for the last 4 or 5 years due to the corruption of the politicians, the regulators, the captains of industry. What I like to call really, it's not only corporatocracy, it's really very much thugocracy. The thugs have taken over the operation of the economic system in the Western world.
Capitalism and its efficacy have been called into question since August 2007. The shockwaves generated by the crisis are reverberating across the world like a tsunami. The impact is felt in the stock markets and banks in every continent, and pundits believe that a crisis is still looming.
All the commentators are sort of talking about is that perhaps in the next year to 18 months to 2 years, we are going to see even deeper problems because the manner in which the financial services industry is manipulating everything else in the economy really does not bode well for the future.
Financial experts around the world are making hectic interventions, but such firefighting measures as stimulus packages and deficit financing by states and central banks have not stopped downsizing, diminishing interest rates, and general enemy.
Today's economic and financial woes and problems all across the world, of course, the result of years and years of mainstream Western economic thought and policies. Well, as things are getting worse and worse, more and more voices are calling for changes to the system and are calling for new systems of economic thought, replacing capitalism. One of those voices belongs to Professor Rodney Shakespeare, professor of binary economics at Trisakti University, Indonesia.
Let nobody think that when the coming economic collapse, which has already started, it is a long process. It has stops down, slopes down, up, and then down, and then a sudden violent collapse. Let nobody think the process hasn't started, and that when it does happen, that we won't be involved in probably in forms of civil war.
Binary economics addresses a number of weaknesses in the current economic system, which are dismissed by conventional economics as being of no or low importance.
The flaws of capitalism. Firstly, that it has a completely false understanding of what creates the wealth. Stemming from Adam Smith, who did his thinking before the Industrial Revolution, the belief, which is spread to everybody, is that only labor creates the wealth.
Almost all of the modern money supply is in the form of interest-bearing debt created and owned by the banking system.
To understand the fall and rise of capitalism, one must first understand the fall and rise of its lifeblood, how money is created.
There seems to be no system as taken for granted and misunderstood as the monetary system. Taking on nearly religious proportions, the established monetary institution exists as one of the most unquestioned forms of faith there is. How money is created, the policies by which it is governed, and how it truly affects society are unregistered interests of the great majority of the population. In a world where 1% of the population owns 40% of the planet's wealth, in a world where 34,000 children die every single day from poverty and preventable diseases, and where 50% of the world's population lives on less than $2 a day, one thing is clear: something is very wrong. And whether we are aware of it or not, the lifeblood of all of our established institutions, and thus society itself, is money. Therefore, understanding this institution of monetary policy is critical to understanding why our lives are the way they are.
At this moment, everybody is conned, is deceived into believing that money only comes from banks. And you are taught that existing money is being lent. Now, that has not been true since 310 years. It's not been true. In 1694, with the setting up of the Bank of England, the provisions in the Act actually say that the bank shall have the benefit of the interest on all the money that it creates out of nothing. You see, it had been gold as the money, but when the gold was deposited, the bankers started issuing more receipts for the gold than was actually gold. And as long as nobody came all at once to get their gold out, it didn't matter. And today, of course, virtually all of the money supply all the time is purely created by computer buttons. The bank is not relending existing money. It's not even lending the deposits of its customers. It is purely something out of nothing.
Unfortunately, economics is often viewed with confusion and boredom. Endless streams of financial jargon coupled with intimidating mathematics quickly deters people from attempts at understanding it. However, the fact is, the complexity associated with the financial system is a mere mask, designed to conceal one of the most socially paralyzing structures humanity has ever endured.
The so-called capitalist structure, the international globalist financial system, it stems from certain institutions creating money out of thin air and then charging the citizens of the nation through their government interest to borrow. In other words, in the United States, it's not the Department of the Treasury that creates the money. It is the Federal Reserve Bank that creates the money and loans it out at a cost to the citizens of a nation. So basically, what we have is a global financial system based upon printing money out of thin air ad infinitum, which constantly devalues the currency.
A number of years ago, the Central Bank of the United States, the Federal Reserve, produced a document entitled Modern Money Mechanics. This publication detailed the institutionalized practice of money creation as utilized by the Federal Reserve and the web of global commercial banks it supports. On the opening page, the document states its objective. The purpose of this booklet is to describe the basic process of money creation in a fractional reserve banking system. It then proceeds to describe this fractional reserve process through various banking terminology, a translation of which goes something like this. The United States government decides it needs some money, so it calls up the Federal Reserve and requests, say, $10 billion. The Fed replies saying, sure, we'll buy $10 billion in government bonds from you. So the government takes some pieces of paper, paints some official-looking designs on them, and calls them treasury bonds. Then it puts a value on these bonds to the sum of $10 billion and sends them over to the Fed. In turn, the people at the Fed draw up a bunch of impressive pieces of paper themselves, only this time calling them Federal Reserve notes, also designating a value of $10 billion to the Fed. The Fed then takes these notes and trades them for the bonds. Once this exchange is complete, the government then takes the $10 billion in Federal Reserve notes and deposits it into a bank account. And upon this deposit, the paper notes officially become legal tender money, adding $10 billion to the U.S. money supply. And there it is. $10 billion in new money has been created. Of course, this example is a generalization, for, in reality, this transaction would occur electronically, with no paper used at all. In fact, only 3% of the U.S. money supply exists in physical currency. The other 97% essentially exists in computers alone. Now, government bonds are, by design, instruments of debt, and when the Fed purchases these bonds, with money it essentially created out of thin air, the government is actually promising to pay back that money to the Fed. In other words, the money was created out of debt. In our financial system, money is debt, and debt is money. Here is a chart of the U.S. money supply from 1950 to 2006. Here is a chart of the U.S. national debt for the same period. How interesting it is that the trends are virtually the same. For the more money there is, the more debt there is. The more debt there is, the more money there is. To put it a different way, every single dollar in your wallet is owed to somebody by somebody. For remember, the only way the money can come into existence is from loans. Therefore, if everyone in the country were able to pay off all debts, including the government, there would not be $1 in circulation.
Whenever just government debt becomes 100% of GDP, it is unrepayable. That's the case with the USA, and of course it's increasingly the case with all the countries in Europe. But you actually have to add into that national debt, private debt, and corporation debt. In my own country, the UK, that figure is now 450%. Now, you either get a collapse when the debt builds like that, or you get a massive inflation. But however you look at it, ordinary people are going to suffer. At this moment, the alleged solutions are to increase the debt.
Since all this money is created out of debt and circulated randomly through commerce, people become detached from their original debt, and a disequilibrium exists where people are forced to compete for labor in order to pull enough money out of the money supply to cover their costs of living.
There is nothing but currency devaluation going on. This exhibits itself also in the fact that people are working multiple jobs, but yet they don't have enough money to pay their own rent or to buy food without going into massive debt.
The banking system, A, adds administration charge and compound interest, and B, does not put it for the real economy, and C, never thinks about spreading the real economy, because you see, these doctrines and these practices represent the interests of the existing wealthy. And the existing wealthy are only interested in sucking up sufficient wealth, either via the interest mechanism or via their control of, whenever there are new capital assets, those new capital assets coming into their possession.
When the government borrows money from the Fed, or when a person borrows money from a bank, it almost always has to be paid back with accrued interest. In other words, almost every single dollar that exists must be eventually returned to a bank with interest paid as well. But if all money is borrowed from the central bank and is expanded by commercial banks through loans, only what would be referred to as the principal is being created in the money supply. So then, where is the money to cover all of the interest that is charged? Nowhere. It doesn't exist. The ramifications of this are staggering, for the amount of money owed back to the banks will always exceed the amount of money that is available in circulation. This is why inflation is a constant in the economy, for new money is always needed to help cover the perpetual deficit built into the system, caused by the need to pay the interest. What this also means is that mathematically, defaults and bankruptcy are literally built into the system, and there will always be poor pockets of society that get the short end of the stick. An analogy would be a game of musical chairs, for once the music stops, somebody is left out to dry. And that's the point. It invariably transfers true wealth from the individual to the banks. For if you are unable to pay for your mortgage, they will take your property. This is particularly enraging when you realize that not only is such a default inevitable due to the fractional reserve practice, but also because of the fact that the money that the bank loaned to you didn't even legally exist in the first place.
The USA is starting to hurt. The student debt is 1 trillion. Private debt is huge. Government debt is 100% of GDP. Food stamps 47 million. Unemployment overall 23%, and nearly 50% in poor groups. And nothing that they're doing is going to change it. It is getting worse. So you're moving towards catastrophe in the USA. You're moving towards civil war.
While capitalism had its good old productive days of agriculture and industry, so-called a real productive economy, then came financialization of capitalism, where they found easier ways to reach the ultimate goal of profit. Not hard work, not industry, rather financialization, financial innovation, derivatives, different markets, Wall Streetization of the economy.
The present money supply is generally not directed at productive and the associated consuming capacity, but instead goes to derivatives, rising asset prices, consumer credit, and putting everyone, individuals, towns, corporations, cities, countries, into ever-increasing debt.
The financial elite saw that they could use their doctrines so as to batten on to everybody, and serving only its own purposes, which of course is to suck up wealth, the great vampire squid sucking up wealth. They've succeeded imposing doctrines and practices which are no longer interested in the real economy, its development, or its spreading.
When we have leveraging of 1 against 100, and you have a problem that the underlying asset is only $1 and it is sold at $100. So really, when as we proverbially sort of say that when problem hits, the underlying asset is really nothing compared to what someone is holding at the end of the day. Now, that problem has been further accentuated in derivatives market, as you said, and also commodities. For instance, rice, wheat, cotton, and all these products, all these sort of, real tangible assets are forward sold as options, and then they're sold as packaged products. And now we are talking about, cost of raw materials becoming expensive. We are talking about food products becoming expensive because the financial services industry, the banking and all these creators of exotic products have come into this arena whereby they're packaging these products and selling it on to other investors. Hence, we have whereby ordinary products that are used by consumers have become terribly expensive, because at the end of the day, all the financial services sector is trying to make money out of these products as well.
At present, 2 lots of financing are required to keep the system going. 1 lot for production and a separate lot for consumption. The 2 lots are continually inflationary, yet all the time, more and more loan money must be created if the whole economic and financial system is not to collapse. Inflation is inevitable with the present system. Forms of productive capital remain narrowly owned, and there is no policy to spread the ownership of productive capacity throughout the population. People do not have their own independent incomes. The practices of the IMF and World Bank, which deliberately trap countries into never-ending debt, keep productive capital and associated consuming power narrowly owned, and an abuse of power are generally bent on ripping off the wealth of poor countries.
People talk in millions and billions, but the money is being created in not trillions, but quadrillions. And the current, straw that broke the camel's back that created the most recent financial collapse was toxic mortgage derivatives in the hundreds of trillions of dollars that were bundled and gambled on.
But what is the be-all and end-all of capitalism? What is the ultimate goal? Of course, profit. And what is the most profitable business in the world?
The military-industrial complex is the enforcement arm of the international capitalist banking cartel, and they use force to leverage their political will.
As far as the USA is concerned, it uses its military might to protect its corporations globally. And many commentators and writers in the recent past have talked about how America uses its military power to support, to provide logistical support and all kinds of assistance to the military so that they can give extended hand to the corporation.
All political power comes at the point of a gun, and the capitalists have the biggest guns and the biggest weapons of mass destruction. And I think this is a key point, and I can't say this enough. During the Cold War, the international banking cartel controlled both the Soviet Union and the United States government, and they did it from beginning to end. And as I was saying before, these are merely political constructs. One can say international capitalism and they would be correct. One can say international communism and they would be correct. They're just political constructs made to leverage assets and control by the international banking cartel.
Francis Fukuyama made a history by calling Western liberalism and capitalism the final chapter of the evolution of humanity. But is that the case?
Well, I think whatever the author of that book was saying, I think he was very arrogant, conceited. It's like all academics in most of the universities in UK and USA, they lack humility because they write well, they speak well, and they are the movers and the shakers in society. Therefore, they feel that they are the most important people and the system that they are supporting is the best system. So this is the sheer arrogance of academics in the West.
Well, thank you for watching. Always follow the money trail with me, Amir Arfa.